Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, blinkers, failures.
He's not a whistleblower, okay?
No. Soldiers, spies.
And you feel compelled to talk about it.
The coverage of the Edward Snowden story. Is he a whistleblower or a leaker? How does terminology affect the coverage of news? What does this teddy bear have to do with anything?
The security bear.
And the Turkish government and its supporters in the media go after CNN. When Edward Snowden, the former National Security Agency contractor, made the decision to leak top-secret documents exposing sweeping U.S. government surveillance of Americans, he would have expected that some people would consider him a hero and others would see him as a traitor. But did he foresee voices in the U.S. media describing him as a weasel, a narcissist, a punk, a high school dropout, and a military washout? That's what's happening. But there is one term the U.S. media are reluctant to use to characterize Snowden: a whistleblower. Because to do so would mean that Snowden revealed government wrongdoing, even though the U.S. Constitution guarantees Americans' right to privacy, and the surveillance programs do the opposite of that. Some in the media have taken the Obama administration to task over its unprecedented war on whistleblowers, but they are in the minority. This is a story that gets to the core of the debate over the relationship between the media and the U.S. government. Our starting points this week are Hong Kong and Washington.
The person responsible for one of the greatest national security leaks in recent American history.
What do you think of Edward Snowden?
I think he's a traitor.
Look at that guy. This guy's a weasel. He looks like a weasel.
Okay.
6207, contact.
The whistleblower Edward Snowden revealed much about surveillance in America. The journalists and commentators who talked about him revealed much about media in America.
He's a punk, like I said, he's a loser.
All of this is part of pathologizing the whistleblower. Whistleblowers are always accused of being out for fame, profit, self-aggrandizement, or revenge. As part of the shoot the messenger and smear the whistleblower campaign, and the fact that it's coming from people who are anchors for major network news. Shame on them.
I think what we have in Edward Snowden is just a narcissistic young man who has decided he is smarter than the rest of us.
In the case of Bob Schaefer, he might just be old. In the case of people who are talking a lot about him being a high school dropout, it's obnoxious and it's elitist for journalists to be bringing that up as if it's an important issue.
He never graduated from high school.
High school dropout.
A 29-year-old kid just throwing open the safe.
And in the case of a guy like Jeffrey Toobin saying that he belongs in jail, I mean, if you're a journalist and you don't think that people should reveal government secrets that affect millions of people, then you shouldn't be a journalist.
In the Snowden case, he revealed himself. So again, naturally we would go after that story and say, well, who is he? That just is something that happens. Hopefully, while you're doing that, you're not forgetting the big story, which has nothing to do with that person. It has to do with the information that is now available to us. So while the government certainly wants to disparage leakers and does everything from reminding the public that this is illegal to leak this sort of information to calling individuals traitors for leaking it, that's really not the role of the media to opine on this person.
The name-calling Snowden has experienced in the U.S. media explains, post facto, his decision to initially take his revelations to The Guardian, a British news organization, rather than an American news outlet. Snowden's media strategy is worth examining. Despite being in hiding, he has done 3 interviews, one with The Guardian's Glenn Greenwald, who has also appeared in the U.S. media to defend Snowden, one with the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, and Snowden also did an online Q&A with Guardian readers.
He's covering both bases. I mean, I think he learned the lessons of what had happened to those before him that had come forward. And so by going to the United Kingdom, and Glenn Greenwald, who himself, has been a lawyer, and he's a journalist, and very active in this space, as a civil libertarian, brilliant move.
He's savvy about the media. I mean, he didn't choose the New York Times, he didn't choose a huge traditional media outlet, and it's perfectly rational because the New York Times has proven that they'll go and ask the administration whether this is okay to print, and they'll negotiate with the administration, and these things can get delayed. And if you're a guy like Snowden, I think it's perfectly rational to go to Glenn Greenwald or straight to the internet and get your story out there yourself.
He's obviously trying to reach a particular audience when he does do these communications or these chats or these videos, and I think he chose Glenn Greenwald. Glenn is with The Guardian, which has also been a lot more candid in writing about U.S. failures and U.S. embarrassments than any other media in the U.S.
Glenn Greenwald calls Edward Snowden a whistleblower.
What we disclosed was of great public interest.
He's not a whistleblower, okay?
Other U.S. media outlets, including the Associated Press, do not. The AP issued a memo on June 10th saying that whistleblowers expose wrongdoing. And since the legality of the NSA surveillance programs is, quote, hotly contested, unquote, Snowden should simply be called a leaker. What the memo did not say is that when Americans have tried to challenge the legality of surveillance programs testing their constitutionality in court, the Obama administration has convinced those courts to block the cases on the basis of the government's need for secrecy.
The whistleblower has a reasonable belief, independent of individual motive, that what they're eyewitness to is a violation of law. It involves government wrongdoing and illegality. That's the fundamental definition. The government clearly wants to make whistleblowers an extinct species, and that means they have to go after the person.
And also, whenever you're dealing with government secrets like this, I mean, the government is the one that's declaring whether or not it's illegal. I mean, the same people that you're revealing information on are the ones saying whether or not it's okay to release that information or whether this program is legal. So by definition, you can't necessarily appeal to the government.
Some people are going to see Snowden as a whistleblower because what he has revealed to them poses all sorts of questions, whether the government's acting legally. In the case of the call records, I think it definitely pushes the envelope of what the law meant, because they're saving all phone calls, not just foreign phone calls. But other people will see him otherwise. That's not for me to judge what he is or isn't. We try, and I think most reporters try to use neutral language when they're describing someone like him.
And journalists don't want to confront the uncomfortable truths, in which they have largely been silent. And they've essentially been lapdogs for the government instead of watchdogs. And ironically, how does a newspaper survive? A newspaper cannot report on the comings and goings of the world around it unless it has sources. Can't. These disclosures themselves, it's part and parcel of the process of reporting the news, that the reporters and journalists involved must have sources.
Which is why one would think the media would spend less time reporting on who Edward Snowden is,
He betrayed his oath,
or the high school dropout he was, and more time reporting on what he revealed. Or as Snowden, somewhere in Hong Kong, typed into his keyboard during the Guardian Q&A session when asked what he thought of the debate he started. Initially, I was very encouraged. Unfortunately, the mainstream media now seems far more interested in what I said when I was 17 or what my girlfriend looks like, rather than, say, the largest program of suspicionless surveillance in human history. Our Global Village voice is now on the coverage and characterization of Edward Snowden.
Snowden passed on using official channels to voice his concerns with the NSA for good reason. I can't disagree with going to the media to detail the US government's massive spying program on ordinary Americans. However, his decision to talk to the Chinese media on our monitoring of China was a step too far. What was the reason for this? There's a fine line between hero and traitor, and Snowden is getting awfully close to it.
While the media seems intent on attacking Edward's character, the fact is that Snowden did the right thing in speaking out publicly. NSA staffers spent 7 years trying to expose the NSA's secret spy program through legal channels. But now even President Obama has said that it's good that we're having this debate about the programs that Edward exposed. None of this would have happened if Edward hadn't been brave enough to blow the whistle.
It's obvious that the corporate media is no wiser as they respond to the Snowden situation. In fact, they're part of the problem. What we need is more independent news sources that will get the information out so we can at least get this government under control, because definitely the United States government and its snooping capabilities are definitely out of control.
It's time now for Listening Post News Bites. A daily newspaper in Turkey has joined Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan in his war of words against foreign media outlets and their quote-unquote lies about the protests there. This past Tuesday, the Turkish daily Takvim published a front-page interview with CNN's Christian Amanpour. It was headlined, "Dirty Confession." Amanpour was quoted saying that CNN's editors made her cover the protests with the intention of destabilizing Turkey for international business interests. The article did carry a small disclaimer saying this interview is not real, but what you will read here is real. So it was a fake. Amanpour posted an angry tweet about the article, and some voices in the Turkish social media criticized the paper. The incident came in the wake of Prime Minister Erdogan's attack on the BBC, CNN, and Reuters in a speech he made to his supporters. For days, you fabricated news, he said. You portrayed Turkey differently to the world. You are left alone with your lies. Turks have had huge issues with the way the protests were initially ignored by most Turkish news channels, which have been criticized for routinely self-censoring. The standoff at the Ecuadorian embassy in London over the legal status of Julian Assange continues. Ecuador's Foreign Minister Ricardo Patiño met with the British Foreign Secretary William Hague June 17th, but said that their talks went nowhere. Assange, who we interviewed last week here on the Listening Post, has now spent more than a year living at the embassy after claiming political asylum there to avoid arrest by UK police and extradition to Sweden over allegations of sexual assault, allegations that Assange denies and says are a ruse to get him to Stockholm and eventually extradited to the U.S. Patiño also met with Assange and said that the Ecuadorian government will continue to ensure the protection we have given him under asylum in our country, protecting his life and particularly his freedom of expression. Patiño arrived in the UK just a few days after the Correa government in Quito passed a new law establishing a body to regulate the Ecuadorian media. The legislation also creates a new broadcast framework in Ecuador. In that, it reserves 1/3 of broadcast frequencies for privately owned outlets, 1/3 for state-owned outlets, and the remaining third for community channels and outlets that are in the hands of indigenous groups. That model is uniquely Latin American, having been first established in Argentina under the Kirchner government. Correa's political opposition is saying that the president is making these changes to stifle dissent. The Greek government's plan to shut down the country's state-owned broadcaster has been thwarted by a court ruling. On June 11th, Prime Minister Antonis Samaras ordered that the radio and TV network ERT be closed as part of a drive to cut government spending and shed state jobs. ERT was taken off the air immediately, putting 2,700 employees out of work. But the order was defied by ERT staff, who quickly occupied the offices and the studios and kept a makeshift schedule of news and talk shows on the air using a satellite uplink in the ERT car park. Labor unions threatened a national strike, which imperiled Greece's ruling coalition government. A judge then ruled that ERT must return to the airwaves. Over the years, the network has been criticized for being a dumping ground for overpaid political appointees that the government did not know what to do with. Prime Minister Samaras defended his decision, saying the organization was sinful for wasting so much public money. But it's not the only government body in Greece accused of that, and many Greeks said that the government was simply singling out the broadcaster in order to control dissent and, in particular, criticism of the austerity drive that is being demanded by Greece's creditors. Given the debate, it's more of a catfight, really, over whether Edward Snowden should be called a whistleblower or a leaker. We're going to take a second look at a piece that we put together recently on journalism and language, a few terms in particular. Journalists are supposed to choose their words carefully, and most news organizations have books that spell out the do's and don'ts of terminology, what kind of language to use when dealing with contentious topics, what terms to avoid. Over the past few months, the world's largest news agency, the Associated Press, has made two significant changes to its style book. Out goes the term illegal to describe certain kinds of immigrants, and the AP also has new rules on how to use the word Islamist. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on changing terminology in the news business and the importance of words.
Words can inform, but they can also inflame. The news business is a minefield of controversial terminology, and 2 months ago, the news agency The Associated Press called time on one phrase: illegal immigrants. The reason given: the word illegal should not be used to describe a person. Illegal, according to the AP, should only describe an action, such as living in a country illegally. It was a victory for Latino advocacy groups who have long said the term is offensive.
The debate about immigration in the United States has changed dramatically. People have an appreciation for the value that immigrants, particularly Latino immigrants, have to the American economy, to American society. And so that explains why we are now more willing or more likely to have some kind of immigration reform legislation go through the Congress. And the AP style book is often just a reflection of changing public attitudes about an issue or a cultural change in America. And so it's a catching up, if you will.
After Illegal Immigrant was dropped from the AP style book, you saw the New York Times and now the Los Angeles Times following suit. And so this really shows the influence of that kind of change on the rest of print media.
AP Style Guide is among the most influential in the news business. The agency provides wire services to thousands of news organizations. That's 1,400 print outlets in the US alone and 5,000 broadcasters around the world. So when the AP makes a change, it matters, not just for the agency, but for all who subscribe to its services and adopt its language. 2 days after changing the way it describes undocumented immigrants, the AP announced it would be revising its use of the term Islamist. The stylebook entry now reads, "An advocate or supporter of a political movement that favors reordering government and society in accordance with laws prescribed by Islam. Do not use as a synonym for Islamic fighters, militants, extremists, or radicals who may or may not be Islamists."
What we're seeing post 9/11 and across our time in a globalizing planet is more sensitivity to what words mean and to the implications the terminology has. And the term Islamist is, I don't know what that means. Is that somebody who believes in Islam?
Protests by Islamists.
Is that somebody who believes fervently in Islam?
Black flags, the Islamists.
Is that an extremist? Is that a terrorist? And that's the problem with that term. This word doesn't make sense. It's almost a racist word.
Just after 9/11, news organizations were already changing their use of language. Reuters issued an internal memo about the use of the word terrorist. The news agency ruled that the word was only to be used if accompanied by quotation marks. After the 2005 bombings in London, the British Broadcasting Corporation issued new guidance for staff to opt for less loaded terms than terrorist, like militant or extremist.
We hadn't banned the word terrorism. What we did say was it is much better to use the word that more correctly describes the activity that we're talking about. Bombers, gunmen, fighters, insurgents, whatever the term is, and only use the word terrorist as a last resort, except where it was quite obviously that the act was an act of terror, an act deliberately calculated to terrorize the population.
Journalists reporting political events have to be careful because the stories they report are already framed by the language used by those in positions of power, be it at press conferences, in official statements, sources, or even institutional names.
Countries, organizations, militaries name their defense forces, just that name, defense forces. What if a defense force goes on the offense? Is it still a defense force?
If Israel calls its army the defense force, then for the sake of clarity and for the sake of simplicity, if nothing else, I think it's probably right to call them by that name.
At the exact moment Israeli defense forces began hitting their targets in Gaza,
we tend to call separatist movements by the name they choose for themselves. We tend to call insurgent groups by the names they choose for themselves. I think people are quite used to this, and they're wise enough and sensible enough to know that if this insurgent group is calling itself this, we don't have to go along with all the adjectives it uses to describe itself.
They call themselves the Free Syrian Army.
They name military operations, Operation Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, or whatever it's going to be.
The start of the campaign called Shock and Awe.
So these are loaded terms. They are often going to reinforce the meaning that its authors, meaning governments, give them, and therefore, almost by definition, they become propaganda. Everybody does it. So what do you do as a news organization? Some of these things you can get around. You can refer to the Israeli military. You can refer to the war in Iraq.
Al Jazeera's style book has addressed all these words. Terrorism, Israeli Defense Force, Islamist, war on terror. You won't see any of these on the auto cue.
But in the world of 24-hour news, increasingly driven by digital content, are style guides still as influential as they once were? Social media and citizen journalism are undermining traditional news institutions, using new technology and introducing random, chaotic elements to the news discourse that no style guide, however well considered, can possibly contain.
Journalism is now in the middle of some very dramatic changes in which anybody can declare themselves to be a journalist, can start a blog, can start a social media site, and that's terrific. You know, it widens the debate.
There can be these editorial guidelines that give clear rules about the use of problematic terms like terrorism. But it's when you get into a breaking news situation and you have cable news filling up its 24-hour news cycle with kind of talking heads and chatter, waiting for the next news update where speculation and rumors really drive things, that you have an imprecise use of language.
This was a dark-skinned male.
These pundits and experts and presenters and journalists are just sort of talking to fill time, and they don't have their, an instant checker with the guidelines.
That's why the AP style book remains important as a source for neutral language. There's much less standardization anymore, and so words can mean anything to anybody.
More Global Village voices now on the importance of terminology in the reporting of news.
I don't think that all media outlets should have a standardized style guide. I think that borders on censorship. I think that it's a style guide's job to push us to ask if the words we're using are precise, or if they're offensive, or if they're actually saying what we think they mean. But it is a style guide's job to get the media to use those words in a thoughtful way, because that's what shapes public discourse.
People who hate political correctness should love when an organization like the AP instructs its journalists to not call people illegal immigrants. It's not like using a term like that is some roguish defiance of authority. It's lazy and crappy journalism. Good style guides don't try to enforce some political view. What they do is they get language out of the way of reporters who are telling stories. Readers don't trip up on words, they follow the story, and that is something that's really important.
Finally, if this week's program has left you feeling a bit exposed to the prying eyes and ears of Washington, worry not. Snuggly the security bear is here to make you feel warm, fuzzy, and safe. A few years back, Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Mark Fiore introduced Snuggly into his cast of satirical characters. He's a teddy bear who puts an ironic, sunny spin on things like warrantless wiretapping and domestic spying. Looks like Snuggly still has some work to do. Even though the surveillance program has been cleared by the 3 branches of government, there are still some Americans who are not on board, namely those who believe in the Fourth Amendment. Mark Fiore's Snuggly the Security Bear is our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
I'm not scary, I'm Snuggly, the security bear. Hi, America, I'm back. Just a few weeks after telling you that snooping on 100 or so reporters was no problem, Snuggly the security bear is back to tell you that snooping on, all of you isn't a problem either. The president says this is overseen by the 3 branches of government. Never mind, it's one branch that lied to the other, and a third who okays what the first wants, 99.97% of the time. Certain sacrifices must be made if we're to keep you snugly and secure. And remember, we're just tracking and storing metadata, which means your phone number, who you called, when you called, where you were standing when you called, how long you talked, what kind of phone you talked on, who you called again, and who called you back. But don't worry, we're not listening to the actual call. And if you happen to be using the internet, we'll be there too, ready to get your emails, videos, chats, search words, and photos, all to keep you snugly and secure. We're watching you. All of you!